Grazie Generale Risuccia, ufficiale della Cavalleria italiana e signore e signore, sono molto onorato di venire qui oggi da Londra per parlare del mio grandissimo amico Amedeo Guillet, che era un grande eroe dell'Italia. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to speak to the Italian cavalry and assorted other officers from different armed forces about this extraordinary individual, Amedeo Guillet. Other speakers have spoken about incredibly wide-ranging subjects, space travel, the careers of Montgomery, who I used to see as a small boy, in fact, because I lived in the same part of Hampshire as him, remember him quite fondly, and Rommel. Amedeo Guillet is not a leader of that rank. He was just an ordinary man like millions of others caught up in the Second World War, and it was his fate as a cavalry lieutenant to take part in the war in East Africa. So I don't think there's great lessons of sort of divisional leadership from Amedeo, but as a model of sort of company commander, I think his rank would really, well, actually more than a company commander, he had a force of about 2,000 locally recruited men. He does illustrate something, and his life was illuminating. And I think the questions I'd sort of asked for in terms of leadership of, did he prepare? Amedeo was about the most meticulous man I've ever met. Was he reliable? He was like a clock. Did he have charm? I'd say absolutely in abundance, and for both sexes. They were very seldom unmoved by an encounter with Amedeo, which was quite an achievement because I knew him really in his mid to late 80s, and he died aged 101 in 2012. I guess, above all, the question that Napoleon always asked of his marshals, was he lucky? Well, Amedeo himself used to say he was the luckiest man alive. And I'd say, knowing how often he escaped death, I would agree with that. Today is the 21st of January, and the significance of this date was completely lost on me until I sort of began thinking about it, because of course it was on this day, on the 21st of January 1941, that Amedeo led the most extraordinary action of his career against the British advance guard that was invading Italian East Africa from the Sudan. Both sides in the Second World War in Africa, East Africa, were very reluctant to get going and fight after the Italian declaration of war against the United Kingdom. Relations between the two sides in Africa were exceptionally good. The British used to go and visit Asmara, the only European city, for miles around, and go to the cinema and go to nightclubs there, and it was the place to attend. Italian colony of Eritrea was a highly sophisticated place with a wide-ranging infrastructure. Asmara, basically a European city. There was railroads. There was a sort of a teleferica from Massawa to Asmara. It was completely different to, say, being a sort of regional officer in the south of the Sudan. In fact, the governor of Sudan was so reluctant to get going with the Second World War that when Haile Selassie arrived, he contradicted this order or strongly disagreed with it and said, certainly not. The arrival of the ex-emperor would only set the Italians off. He had to be reminded by Anthony Eden in person that this was precisely the idea and that war must take place. It did so. The Italians advanced rather precariously onto the lowlands of the Sudan, Eritrea, and the British, after some months of preparation, invaded both from Kenya in the south into Ethiopia and then from the Sudan of the north in the north. And what happened on the 21st of January was that a unit of 9,000 Italian infantry were hopelessly exposed at an under-defended fort with no armor, facing a Gazelle force, the advance guard of the British army, predominantly recruited from the Indian army, in fact. And Amedeo with his men, about 350 cavalry, made his way closer to this Gazelle force through dried up riverbeds, and then this was at dawn, he attacked, charging through the parked armored cars and lorries of Skinner's horse through the 12th, 11th Sikh infantry who were bivouacking, and charged straight towards the gun lines of brigade headquarters of Colonel, later Lieutenant General Frank Messervy's main headquarters, and got within about 25 yards of it. Immediately the British were panicked and started shouting, tank attack, and swiveled their guns away from Keru to face this new enemy and fired. And the result of this was an incredible amount of noise, smoke, and confusion. When a 45-pounder shell hit a horse, it sent it flying about 40 meters up in the air. But it didn't explode. So the shells were going through this charging force of cavalry and landing amid their own lines of the Skinners and the Sikhs, causing absolute mayhem. And for many of the British who saw this event, it remained the most lively event of the Second World War. For goodness sake, cavalry had long been discredited as a force. They were not used really in the First World War to any great degree as a fighting instrument. And to face a cavalry attack was extraordinary. Not for nothing did Frank Messervy turn to one of his officers who had worked in the movie business before the war, saying, "I bet that was more dramatic than ever anything you've put in your films." I'm not going to outline the entire biography of Amedeo Guillet in this lecture, but I will just flick through a few pictures, if I may. And I'll start with this one. I mean, you can see that the clothes were splendid. This is Amedeo as a young lieutenant in full dress uniform. And this is John Keegan, one of our famous British historians, referring in his history of the Second World War to this incident on the 21st January. I don't know why he's got on the 19th of January, the 41, the 4th and the 5th Indian Divisions crossed the frontier north of the Blue Nile. They met little resistance. They at one point faced a force of local horsemen, the Amharic Cavalry Band, led by an Italian officer on a white horse, attempting a death or glory charge against their machine guns. In fact, Amadeo's charge did completely wrong foot the British at Keru. They assumed it was the preamble to a sustained offensive and dug in and wasted 24 hours, allowing General Fongoli's unit of 9,000 infantry to retreat. And the Italians then did regroup on the mountains at Keren and fought the toughest battle they fought in the entire Second World War, which the British did win after nearly 2 months, but it was very finely balanced. In fact, those who fought at both Keren and Monte Cassino thought that Keren was a tougher nut to crack. I'll go on. This is, I included this simply to show the splendid uniforms that Italian officers wore in the mid-1930s. I just wanted to digress at this point because here you see a point I wanted to make about the Italian cavalry was Italy entered the Second World War with 42 mounted regiments of cavalry. They fought on the Don in 1941, leading a full cavalry charge there, the Savoia Cavalleria. But Italian horsemanship, one doesn't associate Italy with fine horsemanship, but in fact, the cavalry training of Italy in the first half of the 20th century was absolutely exceptional. Modern horse riding, this is how you sit on a horse now, today. This is the kind of saddle that you will get today. If you're a horse rider as I am, you'll immediately recognize that this guy is riding like a modern rider of today, ready to take jumps. Whereas this is my grandfather in the First World War in the winter of 1914. Now, he was a very keen rider as well, but look at the way his weight is tipped back in his saddle. He'll get over jumps, but it's pretty hit and miss that he'll get the correct stride and errors could be made. The British were very slow to take on the Capriles system, although my grandfather did have Capriles books and read them avidly, and my mother grew up always thinking the Italian way of riding horses was the best, frankly. Sorry, this is a picture of my grandfather in the First World War. He was a pilot, so like many cavalry officers, they went, and indeed, it was quite interesting to hear the talk about about Ferrari, because Ferrari has the sort of rampant horse stemma, and that is from the Italian cavalry. It was Baracca's stemma. He was a cavalry officer until he became a pilot, and it was taken up by Ferrari as their symbol. My grandfather traded his horse for that precarious machine in the background. Won't bother too much with him. The first war that Amedeo fought was, of course, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, which caused the great rift between Italy and the United Kingdom and France. And Amedeo had been training for the Berlin Olympics and was chosen for the team. So he was an excellent horseman, even by Italian cavalry officer standards. But rather than take part in that, he got a commission in the army as a lieutenant in the Spahis de Libya, a mounted cavalry unit, and took part in the war, in the battles to conquer Ethiopia. These are examples of the kind of enemy the Italians were facing. And this is Amedeo on Christmas Day. Hold on, I don't want to say it's October, that was December 1935. But that's Amedeo crossing the frontier from Eritrea into Ethiopia on the first day of the war. And this is him after having been wounded in the right hand at Selaklakla. A bullet hit his hand and embedded itself in the saddle. He was fighting as a cavalryman in this war, with small arms and a sword, in fact. So, and here are the Spahis de Libya in Rome after the invasion of Ethiopia, celebrating the victory. This is a quite extraordinary series of photographs, but it shows actually cavalry in war. This is Ethiopian soldiers are in white. The Italians have laid down some sort of artillery barrage, and their infantry are on the top of that mountain, firing down on the Ethiopians. I found this picture. It was a very small one in Amedeo's album in his house in Ireland, and it took me a while to understand what on earth was going on, but this is the sequence. So the Italians fired some artillery shells. They moved their little Fiat Ansaldo tanks, which have flanked the enemy. The enemy begin to retreat. Some of them have been shot. And here come the Italian infantry in the back there, and then through it come the cavalry. So this would have been the kind of warfare that Amedeo had experienced in 1935-36. Another quality of Amedeo was that he was very lucky in his connections, his family connections. The clue to his motivation in the Second World War is really in his Francophone name. The Guillets had served the Dukes of Savoy, later Kings of Sardinia, later still Kings of Italy, for generations. Savoy itself was a remarkable survivor as a state on the frontier between Italy and France, but the dynasty had been intact, or governing, since the 13th century. These loyalties ran very deep, and it was natural enough that somebody like Amedeo, whose uncle was a general of division in the First World War, would be an army officer. But he's very lucky here because he was an aide-de-camp to Italo Balbo, about the second most important personality in the fascist regime, who founded the Italian Air Force and later became governor of Libya, where he is here, giving Amedeo a medal for his efforts in Ethiopia. It was a great tragedy for the Italians that Italo Balbo was killed in the first week of the war shot down by friendly fire at Tobruk. He might have put the skids under the regime a little earlier than happened. This is an event in Tripoli. I'll talk about this because it shows you how important Amedeo was or how appreciated his horsemanship was. He's actually the man in the background on the grey horse. In the front you see Mussolini, you see the Fasces being carried through the streets of Tripoli. This was the event for the Sword of Islam, the Spada d'Islam, when Mussolini declared himself the protector of the world's Muslims, without any invitation, I hasten to add. But the reason for it was to tell Britain and France, there's a new player in the Middle East. You didn't give us a single colony in the Middle East after the First World War, in spite of our million dead. We are now going to dominate this sea of ours, and you've got a competitor. That was the point here. Amedeo bought that horse for Mussolini in Germany and trained it for the ceremony. And here is the sword of Islam, which was made in Florence, in fact. His other great mentor was this tall figure here on the left. This is probably the most attractive figure in the entire sort of hierarchy of Italy during the Second World War. It's Amedeo Duke of Aosta, cousin of the king, viceroy of Italian East Africa, appointed to be viceroy after the failures of Marshal Graziani in pacifying the country. He fought against the British during their invasion and died as a prisoner in Kenya, deeply respected by his adversaries. Amedeo had a peculiar, he fought in all Mussolini's war. He fought in the Spanish Civil War as well. It was the first job that he'd got as an aide-de-camp to General Frusci in the Spanish Civil War, and it was the first job he had ever got that hadn't been owing to his family connections. So he was proud to get the job, but the experience in Spain actually was where he grew up, and he went there as a sort of puppyish young subaltern, but he came back quite a questioning, mature man. And I won't speak here of his involvement and his disillusion with the regime, but he was desperate to get to East Africa and asked for a transference to the obscure posting of East Africa before the Second World War because of general disillusion with the whole direction of Italian governments. These are his men that he recruited in 1940 when Italy declared war. These were hastily recruited, mainly Amhara-speaking cavalrymen and infantry with Eritrean non-commissioned officers. Here he is on maneuvers. And this is Amedeo's unit being inspected by General Frusci. This will be in the summer of 1940. Asmara, as I said, was a very sophisticated Italian city of about 50,000 Italians at that point. So it had an infrastructure completely superior to anything the British had in Sudan. Khartoum was a village by comparison, let alone any of the postings in southern Sudan. This is the cathedral at Asmara. You can see it's in sort of Lombard Gothic style, but you will find in Asmara now, Amedeo and I went there again in the year 2000, and you can still find sort of Pizzeria Napoli and Bar Diana and what have you. It's a very, this is the, for example, this is the fascist party headquarters in Asmara. It's a sort of F on its side. That's the idea of it. And from that balcony, it was hoped that the Duce would address his colonialists, but he never actually ever visited the Eritrea. And this is just an example of the Italian infrastructure in Eritrea, Ponte Menebrea. There's a sort of, this is a Dogoli, and on the sort of just beyond Massawa, but there's a dialect inscription from Piemontese there, sort of, "Non custa che custa," let it cost what it costs. We're going to make this. And this is now the President's Palace, but you see this used to be the command post in Asmara, where the Italian generals commanded. Now, on January 41, this is Gazelle Force invading Italian East Africa. They're in American Dodge vehicles there. This is Skinner's Horse, which was a cavalry unit of the Indian Army. Had been mechanized only 2 years before the war. And Lieutenant Colonel Dougie Gray, who is still alive when the book came out, came and visited Amedeo in Ireland. It was his melancholy task to shoot the horses that were wounded after Amedeo's cavalry charge. But it was an event which struck him very strongly First of all, he had seen for the first time a mass cavalry charge and what modern weapons will do to men and horses when fired at a very close range, but also what cavalryman could not be astonished at actually experiencing in 1941 anything approaching the kind of conflicts of the past. Kieru, this is what Kieru looks like today, and Amedeo's cavalry charge would have taken place on the plain on the background there. You can see it a bit closer. All this area has been fought over many times since by the Eritrean People's Liberation Front fighting the Ethiopians and the Cubans. This is Renato Togni, also an Italian cavalry officer. He was Amedeo's second in command of the Gruppo Bande Amara a Cavallo, which was his hastily recruited unit. He was killed by a machine gun during the charge. And this is Togni's grave, Amedeo visiting it in March 2000. This is at Keren, in fact, which was the scene of the serious battle between the most serious battle between the British and the Italians. And this was Lieutenant General, he was then Colonel, but was taken in Burma actually. But Frank Maservi was an Indian Army officer who really was instrumental in defeating the Italians at Keren, and also was the object of Amedeo's irregular cavalry charge in January 41. And this gives you an idea of the landscape. Well, it's a very bad photograph, sorry. It was taken from an old Soviet helicopter, which was put at our disposal to show Amedeo his old battlefields. That bridge over the Wadi there is called, Italians would be rather surprised to know that it's still called Ponte Mussolini. So certain memories linger. And this is the kind of landscape where the Italians made their defense at Keren. You see, it's Reginald Savary was one of the British officers who was fighting Amedeo at the time and had to lead his men from the front, picking up a bayonet and driving the Italians off Mount Cochin. And this is quite curious because, these are just two soldiers of the Second World War, one in the West Yorkshire Regiment, the other in the Granatieri di Savoia. It makes the point, these captions, that there was constant charging and counter-charging at Keren and very high casualties. And the attention of the world was focused on this tiny, now completely forgotten spot in Eritrea because it looked for a while that the British would not crack this. I shall just go through rather quickly some of these other things. Here is Amedeo pointing out his lines at Ad-Teklazan, just beyond Keren on the road to Asmara. The Duke of Aosta surrenders. I think I'll skip through these ones and just... This was Amedeo meeting President Isaias Afwerki. President Isaias, who's I'm afraid turned into a rather autocratic figure now, if not an outright tyrant. But in those days, he was slightly milder. He came to Rome and said, they asked, President, do you want to meet anybody? He said, yes, the one person I want to meet is Amedeo Guillet. So they rang up the house in Ireland. The housekeeper said, well, he's back in his flat in Rome. So Amedeo was immediately called to the Quirinale to meet President Isaias, and we were received there. And Isaias lent him an old Soviet gunship to take him around his battlefields. I was very touched by this. Was the old askari from the Eritrean army came out to meet Amedeo at the cemetery in Asmara. And here they are, these old boys were all veterans of the Second World War. It was a peculiarity of both forces that the British and the Italians fought this war primarily with the units of their their colonies, and the British could account that a job had been well done in their victory over Italian East Africa, but very few of them realized that their own empire was completely finished as well. I'd hoped that this was a British armoured track from one of the British tanks that Amedeo had destroyed at Teklazan, but in fact it's a Soviet one. And here, this is typical of the landscape of Eritrea. It's been so fought over. These are bits and pieces of Soviet war material. And after the Italian surrender in Africa Orientale, Amedeo refused to surrender. He did this for a very sensible reason. He thought that the most important thing that the Italians could do in East Africa was cause as much trouble as possible and to ensure that as many British troops as possible were kept in Eritrea and Ethiopia and away from North Africa, weakening the North African front, which had just been reinforced by Rommel and the Africa Corps. And the Germans were reversing the Italian defeats right at the beginning of the war. And so Amedeo was in hiding. He went to this slum, it's a slum of Massawa, Al-Khatmia, and he went back to see his fellow townsmen. He lived here for about 2 months. And he used to draw water from this well, which is just by the Italian military cemetery in Massawa, and take it to sell in the city because the city water supply had been cut off. This is the governor's palace in Massawa, as it is now, and that's what it was like in the 1930s. I think I'll pass on those. And here we are, coming back from Eritrea at Fiumicino, and unfortunately our baggage had been lost, so Amedeo decided to sit it out during the wait. And here we go. The last service of Amedeo Guillet was to attend his 100th birthday party at the Palazzo Barberini, and it was the last service really he did. I think he had had enough at that point, and he died about 10 months afterwards. This was his house in Ireland, where I wrote the book. And the story is a romantic one. There are 2 women involved here. He was engaged to his aristocratic fiancée, Bice Gandolfo from Naples, and this was his love in Ethiopia, who stayed with him after the defeat of the Italians when he was just a wanted brigand, really. And I think that's Amedeo with my children. I'll stop there.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.